All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to wait a few more minutes to let some more people filter in before we get started. I did just want to go ahead and say, we're having an open Q&A in the chat and the Q&A section. So feel free to, pose questions at any time. Hopefully we'll have a chance to get to those at the end of the presentation. And we'll get through some of your questions. And then, of course, if there are any other questions that I'm not able to cover either in the presentation or during the Q&A section, always feel free to send me an email or give me a call. I'd be happy to talk to you all about that and get all of your questions answered. Thank you, everybody, for coming to our webinar. Today, we're discussing getting started with nutrient solution management. For all of you, especially the freight farmers who are getting started, kind of new to this information, just things to really help you be able to do a lot of the math, the diagnoses, any sort of solution management over time on your own. So I have just a brief little intro about myself. I am Lauren Houston. Currently, I'm the CEA Technical Specialist here at Jackson J.R. Peters. But before that, I have 2 degrees in horticulture from 2 universities down in the South, Mississippi State University and the University of Arkansas. So before I even got here, I was all about horticulture all the time. So to try and kind of streamline things as much as possible today, I've broken our seminar out into 2 different sections. In our first section, we're going to be covering fertilizer basics, and in the second section, we're going to go over more in-depth hydroponic nutrient solutions. So in section 1, we're going to go over how to read a fertilizer label, and then I'm also going to give you a really extra abridged rundown on some basic fertilizer math that you're going to need to know how to do yourself. And then in section 2, we're going to define the basic parameters of solutions, nutrient solutions, and just water in general. We're going to go over water quality, why it's important, what contributes to it. And then we're going to talk about how to manage your nutrient solutions. And then finally, I'm going to go over the importance of routine lab testing. This is something that we always talk about here at JAX that, we firmly believe is really going to help you in the long run in managing those nutrient solutions. So let's get started with section 1 in fertilizer basics. The first thing we're going to go over is how to read a fertilizer label. Fertilizer labels have a lot of information on them, but it's all very helpful and definitely something that you can keep kind of in your back pocket. So even if you're not using our fertilizers, you're able to confidently read a fertilizer label and know what is in that fertilizer and how to use it. So the biggest first thing that you're going to notice on a fertilizer label is those big 3 numbers up at the top. Most fertilizers are going to have these. The big 3 numbers are the total percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in that particular fertilizer formula. So the label I've chosen to use as an example is a fertilizer I have recommended to many of you in the past. It's our 6626 low phosphorus part A. So, for example, on this particular label, this formula contains 6% nitrogen, 6% phosphorus, and 26% potassium. The next section is the guaranteed analysis. This is a part that's kind of confusing for a lot of people, but it reiterates the total percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and also shows you a breakdown of the percentage of nutrients that aren't listed on those big 3, anything that's not nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So if it's in the fertilizer, it's going to be on the guaranteed analysis. For example, our low phos part A, in addition to containing nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, also contains magnesium, sulfur, boron, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. So you have all your micronutrients in there, and it shows you the percentage of each of those that's present in that fertilizer. A little bit below the percentages, we also have, here's an expanded version of that, the percentages of all the nutrients, so you can read it a little bit better. Right below that, we have the derived from statement. Fertilizers are required to put this on there so that you can see specifically where all of those individual nutrients come from and the raw materials that were used to incorporate it into the fertilizer. This is going to be really helpful for you in kind of knowing, how much extra stuff is going on in there. And especially whenever you're talking about micronutrients, you want to look for like iron DTPA, EDTA, zinc EDTA, those are called chelates, and those are going to help you get a good idea of how soluble this formula is going to be at a various range of pH. And then similar to that, we also list the impact on pH of each formula. So what you're usually going to see here is it's going to say potentially basic or potentially acidic. If it's potentially basic, that means that the fertilizer is likely going to raise the pH of your solution over time. And if it says potentially acidic, it's going to lower the pH of your solution. And then what's really important to notice is after that part, it says how many pounds of calcium carbonate equivalent per ton. You don't need to know exactly what that means, just know that the higher the number that's listed there, the more it's going to change the pH. So for example, in this particular formula, the potential basicity is 163 pounds of CCE. So it would be more potentially basic than a formula that said, for example, 50 pounds CCE, but it would be less potentially basic than something that was labeled as 200 pounds CCE. And then another really important factor for y'all specifically is the limit of solubility. This is going to be the maximum amount of fertilizer that you can mix per gallon of water and have it still completely dissolve into solution. For example, our 6626 has a maximum solubility of 2 pounds per gallon. So we really don't recommend mixing more than 2 pounds per gallon of water, or else you're going to have issues with it completely dissolved. We also list the estimated EC on our fertilizer labels. This is going to give you a good idea of the EC you should expect in your solution when you mix at our recommended mixing rate. So for example, on our label for an EC of 0.9, you would be supplying 50 parts per million nitrogen. And then we also include the parts per million breakdown, which helps you kind of get a good idea of the other nutrients that are going to be supplied in a different way from the percentages that are listed on the guaranteed analysis. So for this particular formula, you would know that if you were mixing to supply that 50 parts per million nitrogen that we recommend, you would also be supplying this many parts per million of all the other nutrients. And then finally, we include mixing instructions to kind of give you a good idea of how much fertilizer you're going to need to mix per gallon to hit those target nitrogen rates. So for our 6626, to make 1 gallon of ready-to-use solution at that 50 parts per million nitrogen that we recommend, you're only going to need 3.15 grams of fertilizer. So next we're going to go through some basic fertilizer calculations, some things that I've noticed a lot of not just freight farmers, but hydroponic farmers in general kind of struggle with, and things that are good to know on a daily basis that are going to help you kind of streamline some things whenever you're mixing in-house. So first we're going to go over how to calculate EC adjustments. All of the information that you're going to need for all of these calculations is right there on our fertilizer label. You just need to know what you're looking for. So when you're adjusting EC and you want to know how much to mix to get a different EC than what's listed on the label, the three things that you need to know are the known EC value, which we list on our label. You also need to identify what the mixing rate for that known EC value is. And then you need to decide what your target EC is going to be. So for example, on our label, we know that mixing at 50 parts per million nitrogen gives you an EC of about 0.9. For the mixing rate, we also know that it takes 3.15 grams per gallon of water to get that parts per million nitrogen. And then just for this example, I've decided we're trying to get an EC of 1 instead of the 0.9 that the mixing rate recommends. So really, this isn't complicated. It's not scary. All you need is kind of a basic level math. If you passed Algebra 1, you should be able to do this just fine. So all we really do here is just basic cross multiplication. So you'll see we've listed, we have the 0.9 millisiemens that we know we're going to get at 3.15 grams per gallon. And then that's going to be equal to the 1 millisiemen per centimeter that we want. And we're just trying to figure out what the additional grams per gallon is going to be. So if we cross multiply these, go through kind of your basic math steps of cross multiplying, you'll see that after we do that, we get a mixing rate of 3.5 grams per gallon. And so a good double check to this is to make sure, okay, if I'm increasing the EC, the mixing rate should be higher. That's how you know if you did your math backwards or not. I'm not gonna lie, the first couple of times that I did this, I came out with a lower mixing rate and had to double check my math because clearly that wasn't correct. But for a target EC of 1 millisiemens per centimeter, we're mixing at a slightly higher mixing rate of 3.5 grams per gallon. The next calculation I'm going to walk you through is just adjusting your parts per million nitrogen. So if you're trying to hit a different target parts per million nitrogen, not necessarily a different EC, but you want to know what the mixing rate is going to be to get a different nitrogen level. That information is still on the label. All we need to know for this is the mixing rate for the known nitrogen value, and then the nitrogen value that we're trying to target. So just like in the last example, we're going to stick with the 3.15 grams per gallon. That's going to give us 50 parts per million nitrogen. And for this example, let's say we're doing 75 parts per million nitrogen as our target. And then it's the same steps over again. We're just cross multiplying to see how many grams per gallon we need to mix to get that higher nitrogen rate. So if we go through the steps here, we cross multiply, we'll see that we need a total of 4.7 grams per gallon to get that target 75 parts per million nitrogen. And same with the EC. If you're trying to mix at a higher nitrogen rate, you're probably going to have a higher fertilizer rate. And, vice versa. If you wanted to only mix at 25 parts per million nitrogen, you would have a significantly lower mixing rate. And then I did want to point out really quickly that a lot of these calculations can be done by online calculators we have available on our website. So for example, we have a calculator that does this grams per gallon mixing rate to get your target nitrogen levels. And I plug those calculations into our online calculator just to show you as an example. If we take the percentage of nitrogen that's listed on that label, the 6%, and then we tell the calculator what our parts per million nitrogen that we want to target is, it'll tell us how many grams per gallon we need to mix. And, I built these calculators, so just to double check that the calculators were working correctly as well, I plug this in and you see that we still get the same 3.15 grams and 4.7 grams per gallon. These calculators will also tell you how many grams you need if you're making a concentrated stock solution that would inject at 1 to 100. So it's a 100 times concentrated solution. We have two other calculators available on our website that also calculate how many total gallons of water you would need to mix an entire 25-pound bag of fertilizer and still hit those target rates. And then we have a third calculator that will help you calculate how many milliliters per gallon to set your injectors to hit a target nitrogen rate as well, which is something I know a lot of hydroponic vertical freight farmers kind of struggle with when you have those really complex injector systems where you can set the specific milliliters per gallon. It can get a little confusing. But so we have those calculators available on our website so you can do it yourself and not really have to worry about trying to figure it out. And the last calculation we're going to go through is estimating the changes to other nutrients. So say, for example, that in the last calculation, we did converting 50 parts per million nitrogen and increasing that mixing rate to hit 75 parts per million nitrogen. How would that impact the other nutrients? How far are the other nutrients also going to increase when we increase the mixing rate? For this, we need to know the known nitrogen value and the desired nitrogen rate, like we did last time, so 50 and 75 parts per million nitrogen. And then we also need to use this elemental concentration table to determine what the known value is for the other nutrient that we're trying to figure out how that's going to change. So for example, I chose phosphorus just to see if we increase the nitrogen from 50 to 75 parts per million, how much is the phosphorus going to increase if it feeds at 22 parts per million when we mix at 50 parts per million nitrogen? For this, it's the exact same thing. We're just going to go through, cross multiply like we've been doing. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. You go through, we have our nitrogen and our phosphorus levels, our new nitrogen level, what's the phosphorus going to be? We calculated it out. And at 75 parts per million nitrogen, we're going to see a rate of 33 parts per million phosphorus. So nitrogen increases, phosphorus also increases. So to wrap up this section, I want to give y'all a little quiz. Feel free to kind of play along, but we're going to kind of incorporate all of the math that we've gone over in the past few minutes to see if we can do a more complex calculation. So pull out your pens and paper. It's not graded, so don't worry about it. But for example, say that we mixed our nutrient solution at 50 parts per million nitrogen, like's listed on the label. We know that the solution is supposed to be 0.9 at the EC. So a week later, we let the solution run, the plants are taking stuff up, everything's going great. And a week later, the EC has climbed to 1.5. What would the concentration of phosphorus be in this recirculating system where the EC has increased over time? So if we go through and we do our cross multiplying, we have our 50 parts per million nitrogen at our known EC. We figure out what the new parts per million nitrogen would be at the new higher EC, roughly 83 parts per million nitrogen. So we take that and compare it to our 50 and 22 parts per million nitrogen and phosphorus, cross multiplied, we get 36.6 parts per million phosphorus in this week-old 1.5 millisiemens per centimeter EC solution, right? Easy. Except it's not. It's actually a little more complicated than that. And you should know that as solution recirculates over time, we actually don't know what's going to be in there because we don't know what the plants have taken up. We don't know what has been added back. So that's what we're going to get into here in section 2 in managing hydroponic nutrient solutions. So first, we're going to go over the basic parameters of solutions. Kind of what are we looking for? What's important in the solution that's going to really play into plant health, how plants are going to take up nutrients, that type of thing. So the big 4 parameters that you need to know over time are going to be pH, alkalinity, EC, and the concentration of individual nutrients. This is often annotated as milligrams per liter or parts per million. They're both the same measurement, so you may see different measurements on different lab results. Just know that those numbers are the same. So these basic parameters are all listed and accounted for in our lab testing of nutrient solutions and water solutions. You'll see this is an example of results that actually came out of our lab. So the first 3 parameters that are tested for are that EC, the pH, and the alkalinity. And then below that, we have a complete breakdown of macro and micronutrients. We also test for sodium, chloride, and aluminum. So just kind of starting things off with solution pH. Solution pH is the measurement of the hydrogen ion concentration in a solution. But really all you need to know is that, it's how we rate whether a solution is acidic or basic. So pH has a total range from 0 to 14, where 7 is completely neutral. In pure water sources like RO water or deionized water, your pH would be near neutral. Most RO and DI water sources I've seen range from 6 to 8, but it's pretty close to neutral. For most crops, though, we want to operate within a much narrower range. So most plants are able to take up all of the nutrients that they're going to need at a pH between 5.5 and 6.5. That's where all of the nutrients are going to be completely soluble and plant available. But really, especially in CEA crops and hydroponic crops, we try to narrow it down even further to about 5.8 to 6, sometimes up to 6.2, depending on the plant species and its nutrient requirements. But you'll see kind of on this breakdown in the image here, how nutrient solubility changes at various pH. And most of the nutrients that plants are going to need are going to be at near maximum solubility between this range. So it's not so much that we're targeting a specific pH range for individual nutrients and increasing their availability, but making sure that all of the nutrients your plants are going to need are as available as possible. And between that 5.8 to 6 range is where it's going to be ideal. And then pH also plays in a little bit with alkalinity. They're very closely related, but they are not a measure of each other. That's a common misconception, is that if you want to change the pH, you have to change the alkalinity and vice versa. However, alkalinity measures the buffering capacity of your water. It is completely separate from pH. The buffering capacity really determines how stable your water and your solution are going to be. So the lower your alkalinity, the more a solution is going to be able to change. The pH is going to change and swing over time. And the higher the alkalinity, the more stable it's going to be, but it could also be more stubborn. So having a higher alkalinity isn't necessarily a good thing, but it's also not necessarily a bad thing. So if you have an RO water source with very low alkalinity, that's a great start. You can really change the pH to be whatever you want it to be, but know that it's also going to change on its own pretty significantly. So it's going to take a lot more management over time. Whereas if you have a really hard water source with very high alkalinity, as long as you are able to get your pH in range and where you want it to be, it's not going to be able to swing as dramatically as with a pure water source. But it also could be very stubborn, and you can have a very hard time changing the pH to be within that range that you need it in the first place. Next, we're going to talk about EC and nutrients. So solution EC is the general measurement of soluble salts in a solution. It EC is actually short for electrical conductivity, which measures, how easily electricity can flow through a solution. And the higher the soluble salts, the more electrically conductive a solution is going to be. So EC is a fantastic indicator of general fertility, especially in fresh nutrient solutions. It's a great way to double check, your mixing and make sure that you have mixed correctly and your plants are going to receive all of the nutrients that they need. However, over time, EC is not a good measurement of individual nutrient concentrations. Since EC calculates or accounts for all of the soluble salts in solution, you can't really use EC to judge specific nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium over time. When you mix a fresh solution and we know, the EC on the fertilizer label, then we can kind of guess and know that this is what we have supplied. But as plants take up nutrients, the EC is going to change and those concentrations of nutrients are going to change as well. And then I did want to touch really quickly on the difference between EC and TDS. Lots of people use TDS instead of EC when measuring nutrient solutions. TDS is a measurement of the total dissolved solids in a nutrient solution. It's a very similar measurement to EC, and many times TDS meters will actually be reading an EC and converting that number to a TDS measurement. So TDS is what we call the 500 scale. And so whenever you're converting from TDS to EC, all you need to do is divide that TDS number by 500, and that will give you what the EC should be. I don't really recommend using TDS when at all possible. EC is going to be a much more accurate measurement. But if you do end up, if you find that you have a meter that only reads in TDS and that's what you have to use, just know that you absolutely can convert that measurement to EC and still get, pretty good readings. And then the total concentration of nutrients in a solution as well. Also shortened to milligrams per liter or parts per million. In our lab results, we show a complete breakdown of all of the nutrients that are going to be in your solution, and we list ours in parts per million. So here on our lab results, you can see that this particular water source has low nitrogen, all that type of stuff. This is going to be the kind of results that you're really looking for, especially when you're trying to manage a solution over time or diagnose a nutrient deficiency. Being able to see the differences in concentrations between all of those individual nutrients is going to give you a much better idea on what's available to your plant at any given time. So with water quality, what exactly are we looking for? I know a lot of you have come to Jax to really get a fertilizer recommendation to get your farms up and running. And we always ask for water quality analysis before we get started and make a fertilizer recommendation. This is because there are a wide range of water sources. And the water source that you're using is really going to have a big impact on the nutrients that are available to your plants and which fertilizers we're going to want to start with. So whenever we do a source water analysis, We're looking for mostly the pH and the EC and alkalinity, but also all of the mineral nutrients and the levels of sodium and chloride in your water. So on the bottom here, you'll see an example of a pore water source. Um, it's starting off with a 7.5 pH and a zero point 0.6 soluble salts. Those on their own are not necessarily bad, but if you look, we also measured that this water source has over 150 parts per million sodium. So that sodium was contributing significantly to the EC, that zero point 0.6 EC, and over time, especially in a recirculating hydroponic system, that sodium is going to accumulate over time and compete with essential nutrients for plant uptake. Also, in systems that manage based on a EC set point, that's going to artificially drive the EC up much higher. So your automatic dosing systems are not going to dose as frequently, and the plants are going to have really low fertility, low levels of nutrients available to them. So I would expect to see a deficiency fairly quickly with a high sodium water source. But on the right here, we have an example of a pure water source. So this water source is starting at a pH of exactly 6, which is amazing. Incredibly low soluble salts, 0.02. And you'll see that the sodium and the chloride that were measured in this water source are both below 10 parts per million. It's practically non-existent. It's not going to cause any problems. But as we learned from, the basic parameters slide, it also has a very low alkalinity. The alkalinity is only 6 parts per million. So this water source is a fantastic starting water source. You're going to be able to do pretty much whatever you want to it in terms of fertilizer and being able to add back exactly which nutrients you're looking for. But in this particular water source, I would want to keep a very close eye on the pH and how it changes over time, because that pH is probably going to swing pretty dramatically and going to need a lot of adjustment. So how does water quality specifically impact nutrient selection? Whenever we're making a fertilizer recommendation, when we get those results back, how is that going to determine which formulas we're going to recommend? So one of the biggest things that we look for is pure versus hard water sources. Hard water sources tend to have a lot of calcium and a much higher pH. So those particular water sources, we could probably select a fertilizer formula that's going to have low or no calcium, depending on how much calcium's in the water, to really help you make use of that free calcium that you're already receiving from your water. You don't need to add back any more calcium because you already have some. Whereas a pure water source, we're going to need to supply everything directly from the fertilizer. And definitely keep an eye on the pH. Like I was saying, those lower alkalinity water sources tend to swing a little bit more dramatically. And then in really specific cases where the sodium and the chloride are very high, we may even want to look at some sort of a water purification system, installing an RO or a DI system, finding an alternative water source like collecting rainwater, because extremely high sodium and chloride can cause significant nutritional issues. And like I said, can drive the EC up over time, which is going to make it difficult for the plants to access the nutrients that you are supplying to them. So how do we manage nutrient solutions over time? There are two main, kind of categories that hydroponic systems fall into that kind of determine the best way to manage a solution. So the first one is going to be an open system where fertilizer solutions are mixed in a reservoir, the water goes out and is fed to the plants, and then it goes down the drain. It's only applied to the plants once. And in that case, you would want to collect runoff from the drain end of the system to kind of get a good idea on what the plants were taking up as that solution flowed through their root zones and what was being left behind. However, for most of you, you're operating with closed systems where the fertilizer solution is mixed in a reservoir, it's applied to plants, and then it circulates back to that reservoir so that you can reuse the solution the next time the plants get irrigated. This is a fantastic system. It really increases your water and nutrient use efficiency so that you're having lower inputs over time. However, that recirculation also makes the nutrient management a little bit more complicated as you're trying to replace what the plants are taking up without adding back too much extra that's just going to continue to recirculate over time. A lot of these systems have automatic meters and monitors and automatic dosing units to maintain particular EC and pH set points, which is how most of your farms run, I think. And, as I said, water quality and the nutrients that you're supplying are going to play a big role into how that EC changes over time. You also want to keep an eye on the pH of your solution, not just to make sure that your plants have a pH that lets the nutrients be available over time. But as plants take up nutrients, they also change the pH of their solution. So as plants are taking up nutrients that are positively charged, that solution pH is going to drop. And as plants take up negatively charged nutrients, the pH is going to climb. So just kind of keeping an eye on how the pH changes over time can give you a general idea of which nutrients are being removed from solution a little bit faster so that you know what needs to be replaced. Like I said, cations are positively charged ions. As the plants take those up, those extra charges kind of get kicked back off into solution. That's what's going to cause the drop in pH. And then similarly with negatively charged anions, that negatively charged hydroxyl group is what gets kicked back off and ends up recirculating in solution to change the pH over time. So for these recirculating systems, when you're managing your solution based on the overall EC, you want to know what an acceptable range is going to be to know how your solution nutrients are changing over time and what the plants are taking up and what needs to be added back. For most hydroponic and CEA crops, an acceptable EC range is going to be between 1 and 2.5. That's going to depend a little bit on the crops and which fertilizers you're using, but that's kind of a good guideline range to start with. Whenever you're watching how the nutrients and the EC change over time, it's important to keep in mind that if the EC is being consistently low, the EC is dropping over time, that's because plants are taking up the nutrients, they're removing those charged ions from the solution, and it's lowering the EC. So if your EC gets too low, you could be at risk of developing nutrient deficiencies from those nutrients that are going to be lacking in solution. But if your EC is steadily climbing over time, that could be an indication that you have excess nutrients or excess salt accumulation, that sodium and chloride from those hard water sources that's accumulating over time. That's going to drive your EC up. And it's really important to get these solutions tested when you see this starting to happen to really identify, is it the nutrients that are building up over time? Is it a particular salt? Are my plants going to end up with a nutrient deficiency because the EC is consistently high while some essential nutrients might be lower in concentration? So this is just an example to kind of show you how solution EC can change over time and how EC doesn't really give you the full picture of the nutrients that are in your solution. This is an example of a hydroponic lettuce farmer who was completely changing his reservoir about every 2 months. He was mixing his fresh solution with a target EC of 2. So you'll see in that fresh solution row at that target EC of 2, he was supplying about 180 parts per million of nitrate, his phosphorus, potassium, all the other macronutrients look great, and he had really low sodium to start with. And then after just 3 weeks of recirculating and maintaining that EC of about 2, he ended up with a significant accumulation of phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, magnesium, and even a little bit more sodium over time. And then what you really want to pay attention to is that the nitrate and the calcium both dropped. The nitrogen dropped from 180 parts per million to about 20. So even though his solution EC was really close to that target EC that he was mixing 3 weeks prior, his plants were starting to show signs of nitrogen deficiency because there was almost no nitrogen left in the solution, even though he had been consistently adding fertilizer over time. that nitrate was just the first thing to get pulled out of solution every time, but the EC appeared high because all of the other macronutrients were accumulating in that solution. So now we're just going to go over some common nutritional disorders that you're likely to see and experience, mostly because of how those solutions are managed based on EC. So the biggest, most common nutrient deficiency in a recirculating hydroponic system is going to be nitrogen deficiency. Like I said, with this particular grower, even though he was maintaining that EC, he had almost no nitrogen. But so he came to us because he was starting to see symptoms, but what do those symptoms actually look like? Nitrogen deficiency, as the most common deficiency, it's most common because nitrogen out of all of the nutrients is needed in the greatest quantities by plants. It's involved in almost every plant biological process. It's crucial for plant growth and development. And when nitrogen is low, the plant is essentially just going to shut down and try to stop doing whatever it is it's doing. Nitrogen is a mobile element in plant tissues, which means that whenever a plant starts to experience deficiency, it can pull nitrogen out of older tissues and relocate it to more actively growing younger tissues. So whenever you have a mobile nutrient deficiency, you're going to see the deficiencies in the older leaves first. This is an example of some hydroponic parsley that was experiencing a nitrogen deficiency, and you can see those older leaves kind of at the bottom really dramatically turning yellow, but the tissues the newer growing tissues seem, almost healthy and fine. They're green, and that's because they're just pulling all of the nitrogen from that older tissues into the newer tissues. But if there's no nitrogen applied at this particular stage, the entire plant is going to start to yellow and, die back a little bit. And then the second most common nutritional disorder that I see in hydroponic leafy greens mostly is going to be calcium deficiency. So just like with the nitrogen, even though this particular grower was maintaining this EC set point, the calcium was dropping over time. So unlike nitrogen, calcium is immobile, which means that the plant cannot move it from older tissues to younger tissues. So whenever you start to see a calcium deficiency, you're going to see it in the newest growth first. In hydroponic lettuce, this mostly shows as what we call tip burn. So right on those newer developing leaves, the edges, you start to see kind of that brown tip. It'll progress around the edges, and all of those newer leaves are just going to look crumpled and bad. And that's because, especially with head lettuce, even if there is calcium available in the nutrient solution, if there's not enough airflow, enough air movement, if the plant isn't able to transpire enough, if the humidity is too high, all these reasons, the plant isn't going to be able to pull water all the way through those plant tissues, especially the plant tissues that are really tightly clumped together. So even though there's calcium in the solution, sometimes it's just not being able to pull it through those tissues without the help of additional airflow. And then this is just an example of really severe calcium deficiency. This had progressed from just regular tip burn to the entire, inside clump of those newest leaves kind of dying before they even were able to expand at all. So whenever we're diagnosing and treating for nutritional disorders, before we just start adding things to the nutrient solution, we suspect that we have a nutrient deficiency. You don't want to just start dumping calcium or dumping nitrogen into the nutrient solution. You want to double check all of the potential causes of the deficiency before treating it, or else, you might make it worse unintentionally. So the first thing I always like to check is going to be the pH in the solution or the root zone, because the improper pH usually will induce micronutrient deficiencies. So as we talked about in the pH slide, the 5.5 to 6.5 is going to be our ideal range of solubility. But you'll see just slightly outside of this ideal range, almost all of the micronutrients suddenly become less soluble and less plant available. So if the pH in your solution swings around like crazy and it suddenly drops and it's just sitting around 4.5 to 5 one day, even though the macronutrients are still mostly available and the plants are looking okay, you definitely want to check on that whenever you start to see deficiency symptoms. And then same thing if your pH climbs a little bit too high, you're at 6.5 to 7.5, they start to become a little less plant available on that range too. So if you suspect that you have an iron deficiency or a manganese deficiency, you got tissue testing to confirm that that's the issue that you're having. Before you go adding micronutrients to the solution, check the pH, because adjusting the pH will make the micronutrients that are already in that solution more plant available and the plant will be able to access them. But if you don't adjust the pH and you just add more micronutrients, the plant still is not going to have access to them. And then when the pH is adjusted and fixed, suddenly there will be too many and you risk causing a toxicity on top of the deficiency that you were already struggling with. And then another common issue, especially in recirculating hydroponic solutions, is inappropriate nutrient ratios. So nutrients with similar ionic charges, being, either cations or anions, will often compete for plant uptake. The biggest one that I usually see is potassium, calcium, and magnesium. These three have very similar ionic charges. And since the plant itself cannot identify what is potassium, what is calcium, we need to supply them in the ratios that the plants are going to use in their tissues. So whenever we're mixing a nutrient solution, we try really hard to supply about a 4:2:1 ratio of potassium to calcium and magnesium. That's going to be the ratio that the plants are going to utilize it in the tissues. And so that's the ratio that we want plants taking them up at. And then another issue is an overabundance of sodium or chloride. Sodium specifically has the same ionic charge as potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And if that's really high in your solutions, your plant's not going to be able to tell the difference. And so it might end up taking up sodium instead of the potassium or the calcium or the magnesium that it really needs. And this is just an example of that potassium, calcium, magnesium ratio breakdown in our supplied fertilizer solutions. So I've spoken with many of you about, your water quality, made fertilizer recommendations on what you should add to it. You'll see if I recommended just our 6626 and our 1500, this top row is what your breakdown would look like. And your ratio of potassium to calcium to magnesium just supplied from the fertilizer solution is going to be roughly 5 to 2.7 to 1. So that's not exactly ideal, but it's very close to that 4 to 2 to 1. And in most cases, the amount of potassium and calcium that are also coming from your water source, if your water source has a lot of magnesium, when you account for the minerals present in the water, that's going to even out to be much closer to the 4 to 2 to 1 that your plants are going to need. And then two, if I recommended to you our 6626, 1500, and Epsom salts, that's likely because you have very high calcium in your water. So if you look at the nutrient breakdown of using those three together, you get a ratio of 2.3 to 1.3 to 1, which is much lower than the ideal 4 to 2 to 1. But in those particular situations, it's because you had so much calcium in your water already that we need to increase the magnesium. So depending on the Epsom salt mixing rate that you've gotten, that would balance the potassium, calcium, and magnesium back out, which is why it's so important to start with a water test and know what you have from the beginning so that we can more accurately tailor your nutrient solution to match your water so that the plants are getting what they need. And then another example with sodium accumulating over time. This is an example of a water source that wasn't great, but the solution was being managed really well. The EC was being consistent over time. But even still, the starting water source had a lot of sodium in it. And the sodium was competing with that potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And you can see this is tissue tests that we did on the crops that were being grown in this particular water source. And the sodium in the tissue had climbed to over 6,000 parts per million. The tissue was slightly deficient in a handful of nutrients and things just weren't looking great. And it's because all that extra sodium in the solution was being taken up by the plant in place of the nutrients that it needed. So whenever we're diagnosing deficiencies, even if the nutrients that your plants need look like they're doing okay and they're about at the range that we would want them, I always double check the sodium level because really high sodium in tissue is going to tell me that the plant is taking that up because it needs something else and it's not getting access to it. And then that just brings me to lab testing. I wanted to go over how important routine lab testing is to avoiding these particular nutritional issues. Like I said, when we do a water source, or if we're just testing to make sure that your fertilizer solution is right for your plants, knowing a complete breakdown of what's in the solution is going to be more helpful in making intuitive nutrient decisions than, being able to visually identify deficiencies or anything like that. And leading into that, lab testing or diagnosing issues once you already have a problem is going to be much more effective and efficient than kind of going based on visual symptoms. Lots of nutritional disorders have very similar visual symptoms. If you have more than one nutritional disorder, the symptoms can get kind of confused and mixed up. And, even if you have a general idea of what it is that is causing the problem, getting the solution and the tissue tested to, concretely identify the problem with actual data is going to be invaluable. And then I just wanted to mention that, we can do a lot of these lab testing services for you here. Here in our lab, we offer tissue testing, media testing, and solution testing. We can test for all the macro and micronutrients in tissue, media, and solution. For solution, we do all of the parameters that I've listed, the pH, alkalinity, and EC. And we can test for additional contaminants like sodium, chloride, and aluminum. So thank you all for being here today. Your big three key takeaways are going to be that one, water quality is absolutely the first step in developing a nutrition plan that you can be confident in. Starting with, as much information as possible is going to help you to make those decisions that are going to significantly reduce any issues that you could run into later on. And then even if you have automatic management and dosing systems, you still need to pay attention to what's going on. You can't just kind of guess at things based on an EC or a pH. And especially depending on your water source, changes can happen really quickly. So it's better to continually monitor your solution and make adjustments as needed before, letting the solution kind of get out of hand and making it difficult to make those adjustments in the future. And it's better to make adjustments before plants start to show any nutrient deficiencies as well, so that you could hopefully avoid deficiencies or toxicities entirely. And then finally, lab testing is going to be the most accurate tool for diagnosing any issues and making fertilizer decisions. pH and EC absolutely do need to be monitored and adjusted every day. But whenever it starts to get more complex than that, you're going to want to know exactly what's in your solution and exactly what's going on over time. So you really can't beat a comprehensive nutrient analysis for the amount of information and help that it's going to give you in managing these systems over time. And that's all I have for y'all today. I hope that this was really helpful for you. And at this time, we'll open it up to Q&A, answer some questions if you have any. And otherwise, thank you again for being here. And just know that Jax is here for you to help you. Our lab is here for you. And if you want to get in touch with me afterwards, you have my email address. That's our phone number. I'm extension 41. Just feel free to reach out whenever, and we're happy to help. All right, so let's see if we have any questions. If there are no significant problems, how many times a year should the water be tested? That's a great question. So, depending on your water quality to begin with and your water source, I would say 1 to 2 times a year for hydroponic systems. If you have a really hard water source that is prone to changing, wells don't usually change and tap water doesn't usually change. But even still, it's better to get a baseline at least once a year to make sure that you haven't had any significant differences in water quality, from one year to the next. But yeah, like I said, if you're not having significant problems, you don't need to have just the base water tested on a regular basis. Once a year will be absolutely fine. How often should the pH be checked for? Or how often should the solution be checked for pH and EC? That also depends on how big your system is and what types of plants you're growing. Um, the larger the system, usually the more stable the nutrient solution is going to be. Really, you can't go wrong with testing as frequently as possible. So, if you're having to test manually by hand, I would say try to do it every day or every 2 days. It also depends a little bit on how many different crops you're growing. If you're growing in a monoculture so that you can really assume that the plants are taking up nutrients evenly throughout the crop, then yeah, you could probably push it to every 1 or 2 days. But if you're growing lots of different crops, say you have lettuce, you have some kale, you also have basil and parsley, those nutrients aren't going to be taken up quite as evenly since some plants will have higher demands for particular nutrients than others. And in that case, the pH and the EC do tend to change much more quickly as well. So if you're growing in a mixed system, I would say every day is pretty much essential. What is the best for nutrient analysis tissue? What is best for nutrient analysis tissue media? I'm sorry, could you be a little more specific? What are we testing for? Are you asking what's best for diagnosing nutrient deficiencies? Um, okay, great. Yeah, so for diagnosing nutrient deficiencies, um, I would say we always want to take a look at your solution to see what is being applied to the plants, but also tissue to see what's deficient in the tissues. So, if you're really trying to pick and choose and you just want to send one sample for deficiency analysis, I would say the nutrient solution is going to be the easiest to change. So I would want to look at nutrient solution, but in confirming a particular deficiency, tissue is always going to be very helpful as well. So that's kind of a tough question. There really isn't, one test that's going to answer all the questions you need answering. But if you're really in a hurry and trying to be snappy about it, I would say nutrient solution. Let's see, what nitrogen to potassium ratios do you recommend for vegetative and generative stage of a crop? That's a good question. Nitrogen to potassium, a lot of times, especially for leafy greens, we're looking more for about a 1-to-1. For generative stages for like flowering and fruiting crops, you do want a higher potassium, but the specific nitrogen to potassium ratio is going to be at least slightly dependent on your crop species and type. Fruiting crops like tomatoes are going to need a much higher potassium level than, say, like a edible flowers. So the nitrogen to potassium ratio is definitely going to change depending on your crops. But absolutely feel free to follow up with me individually on that. And we can really kind of look at what you're doing and what types of plants you're growing to make sure that you're hitting those nutrient targets. Let's see, what would you estimate as an appropriate budget for testing over 1 year? I would say, depending on your crop types, your farm and production size, a good appropriate budget would be at least $200 or $300, maybe. All of our in-house testing, our nutrient and media analysis are $46 per sample, and then tissue is a little bit higher than that and can vary depending on what types of testing you're trying to do. But for just kind of routine management, checking on your solutions, without having to diagnose any major deficiencies, just kind of getting baseline information, yeah, it's a few $100s, but if you're, really large scale or, trying to do really routine, like weekly nutrient monitoring, then it would jump up a good bit. But that routine monitoring really does kind of depend on your uh, production size. Is a scheduled flushing of system recommended, say weekly, to avoid salt buildup? You shouldn't have to do a flush weekly. The only time I would recommend a weekly flush is in extremely small hydroponic systems, and by extremely small, I mean like countertop kitchen hydroponics. Um, Really, as long as you're managing and maintaining the nutrient solution, accurately and well, depending on the size of your system, you shouldn't have to do a complete tank change for at least a month. That again is going to depend on what types of crops you're growing and the kind of variety that you have through the system. But yeah, any system of a decent size, over a few hundred gallons that you can really keep track of and keep an eye on, you should be able to push to 3 or 4 weeks, if not longer. If regular water changes aren't feasible based on the size of a deep water culture system, how often should I get the water tested for nutrients to ensure I'm getting the correct levels of nutrients? That's a great question. Um, Really, if doing complete reservoir changes is a struggle, that's when I recommend getting your solution tested weekly. That's going to be ideal for you, collecting something midweek so that we get it by the end of the week and then we can look at it and talk about it the beginning of the following week is going to be the best way to maintain your system for as long as possible. Being able to really kind of target specifically what needs to be added back to the nutrient solution and make adjustments that way instead of going based on a general EC. Um, I've definitely spoken with farmers who are growing in, multi-thousand gallon DWC systems that, doing tank changes or reservoir changes just isn't really an option. So yeah, it's as frequently as possible is going to be the best way to do it. Let's see. What would be the annual testing budget for a small volume NFT system? That depends too on the type of testing that you're going to need to have done. Um, Really, if your water isn't changing that much, your plants are looking healthy, you're doing fairly routine reservoir changes, you know, I'm gonna stick with my original answer of $200-300, as long as you're just doing kind of maintenance testing. If you were doing diagnostic testing for a particular issue, that's gonna add to that. But how do you continually feed Jack's nutrients without runoff? In like a media-based system? Okay, I'll wait for a follow-up on that one real quick. What is the best container for water samples? As long as it's clean and has a lid, most water samples that we get in here to the lab, people just use a recycled water bottle. It really doesn't have to be complicated. We need at least 16 ounces of solution to be able to do all the testing that you need done and to have a little bit extra in case we need to rerun some tests. But yeah, just clean water bottle is fine. How do you know when you should change water? In a recirculating hydroponic system, like I said, the best way to know is going to be to monitor your pH and EC over time. If for whatever reason your EC is climbing just like crazy, best to just completely change the reservoir, and that's going to clear those issues up as quickly as possible. But if everything is looking good and you're not having any particular issues, depending on the size of your system, I would say every 3 to 4 weeks. Given proper management, we definitely can push that out farther. There are some systems that will run for multiple months before tank changes. But yeah, if you're seeing your pH and your EC do something really weird and you can't, for whatever reason, send in a solution sample to see if there's a particular imbalance that's causing that, then the easiest thing to do is going to be to change your reservoir and just start with fresh solution. Could you elaborate on the two types of hydroponics discussed earlier, namely drip to a gutter and flood or tray type, by going back to the relevant slide? Great Farm Systems is the drip to gutter. Yeah, I'll actually be sharing these slides with all of y'all in a follow-up email in a little bit. But the drip to gutter type system or NFT systems, flood trays, those types of things, they're all recirculating hydroponic systems. So all of your solutions are being reclaimed and circled back through the reservoir and the EC adjusted. So you shouldn't really have to worry too much about those open systems. That's more for large scale fruiting crop production, longer term crops that are growing in media or large containers that are receiving just drip irrigation and then everything's flowing out the bottom and is not returning to the reservoir. I work with perennial citrus crops in recirculating hydroponic systems. Many of our plants are started in various media, including peat-based mixes, and only later transferred to closed-loop ebb and flow hydroponic systems. Even when using Jack's feed 15520, we experience pH instability and micronutrient deficiencies, likely due to residual effects from peat and/or prior over-fertilization. What are the best practices for transferring plants grown in media into hydroponics without introducing instability? That's a good question. Yeah, aside from, depending on the size of the plants, being able to completely rinse the roots of that prior media, there isn't really going to be a great way to help the plants themselves adjust to the new system. For the pH instability, we definitely could look at adding potassium bicarbonate to help increase the alkalinity and buffer the solution more. That would help to, really minimize how dramatically the pH can swing over time. But I see that you're using the 15520, so you're probably already using tap water that's fairly hard. Um, that's something that I would really like to dig into more. If you wanted to reach out separately, we can definitely discuss that and see if we can't figure out something going on there. When using rainwater, how often do you need to check the sodium levels? That's a fantastic question. So really rarely ever. If you're using exclusively rainwater, there really should be almost no sodium in your water at all. Any sodium is going to be, extra coming in from somewhere else. I wouldn't really worry about sodium accumulating over time so much as just actual mineral nutrients that are being supplied and making sure that those ratios are staying balanced the way that they need to be. But for rainwater and other pure water sources like RO or DI water, your starting sodium is going to be next to nothing, and so odds are it's not really going to accumulate over time either. Let's see. If changing from one nutrient blend, like Freight Farms nutrients, to Jack's, do we need a full tank water change? Or can we just flush the nutrient dosing tanks and then introduce the new nutrient blend to the existing tanks? A full tank change would be best. That's how you're going to get the most consistent results and know exactly what's in your system. Um, but I mean, you could add Jax directly to it. I just wouldn't recommend it. It's depending on how long that solution has been recirculating, you're probably getting close to needing to do a tank change anyway. So just starting with a clean slate is going to be the best way to make sure that your plants are getting everything in the proper ratios and at the proper levels they need. All right. Do we have any more questions? All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to let y'all go. This has been recorded. We're hoping to get a link out to you guys so you can go back and watch it later. I know I got the comment that I speak a little quickly, but I was trying to get you as much information as possible, as quickly as possible. So you'll be able to go back and rewatch, and we're also going to send you the slides so that you can go back and take any notes that you would like to as well. But thank you all so much for coming. We were really excited to be able to do this for you. And if you have any additional follow-up questions, as I said, always feel free to reach out to me. We're happy to help.